When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, he set forth a moral vision for all Americans, where we would one day judge each other not by the color of our skin, but on the content of our character. 8 years ago, this country took a giant leap forward in fulfilling the dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when the American people judged President Obama on the content of his character and elected him as the first African American to become president of the United States of America. 4 years later, the American people again elected President Obama to a second term. Let's take a look at how life has become better under the leadership and stewardship of President Obama. 65 years after President Truman made the first proposal for national health care, it took President Obama's leadership and political will to get it done for the American people with the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Obamacare was signed into law in March of 2010. There are now over 24 million newly insured people under the Affordable Care Act, and the uninsured rate is at an all-time low. In addition, the Affordable Care Act also expanded the eligibility for Medicaid for low-income persons unable to afford any private health insurance. 31 states in the District of Columbia opted to participate in the expanded Medicare programs, which offered health care coverage for people who earned up to 138% of the poverty level. In addition, over 15 million people have been covered by the expansion of Medicaid managed by the states. Prior to the Affordable Care Act being passed, the number of people uninsured was over 48 million people, which represented 16% of our population. Today, the rate of uninsured has dropped to 8.6%, the lowest rate in American history, and amounts to 27 million people who are currently without insurance. While President Donald Trump and the Republicans in the House and the Senate have focused their attention for the last 7 years on repealing and replacing Obamacare, let's recognize one important fact: they failed. The Republicans never did anything to bring about any program for national health care until President Obama passed the Affordable Care Act. Therefore, regardless of what the Congress and President Trump do to weaken the Affordable Care Act, the credit for making America join the rest of the civilized world with national health care for all of our people will always be the legacy of President Obama. We may take a step backwards under the Republicans now in power, but the march forward for national health care will always be the result of President Obama's political and moral leadership in the face of vehement opposition from Republicans in Congress, not one of whom voted for the Affordable Care Act. Our nation owes a never-ending debt of gratitude for the moral leadership of President Obama, who showed everyone in this great country of ours that health care is a fundamental right for all of us and not a privilege for only those of us who can afford it. While national health care will always define the presidency of President Obama, let's take a look at some of his other achievements, which have improved the life of all Americans, and most especially African Americans. The president enacted permanent expansions of the Earned Income Tax Credit and Child Tax Credit, which together now provide about 2 million African American working families with a very substantial tax cut. A recent report from the Census Bureau found that real median household income has grown by 5.2%, and the number of people living in poverty fell by 3.5 million. The poverty rate, although still high, fell from 14.8% to 13.5%, which was the largest one-year drop since 1968. The poverty rate for African Americans fell the fastest in 16 years. Since the start of the Affordable Care Act, the uninsured among non-elderly African Americans has declined by more than half, with over 3 million people gaining health insurance. Life expectancy at birth is the highest it's ever been for African Americans. The high school graduation rate for African American students has hit its highest point in our history, still a paltry 72.5%, but dramatically higher than ever before. Since President Obama took office, over 1 million African American and Hispanic students have enrolled in college. The U.S. Department of Education is now responsible for funding more than $4 billion for historically black colleges and universities each year. The incarceration rate for African American men and women fell during each year of the Obama administration and at their lowest points in over 2 decades. The number of African American juveniles who are committed to juvenile facilities fell by more than 30% since 2007. In 2014, President Obama launched My Brother's Keeper, an initiative to address the persistent opportunity gaps faced by young boys and young men of color to ensure that all young people can reach their full potential. Under the leadership of President Obama, a Council on Women and Girls of Color issues a report that identified 5 data-driven issues where interventions can promote opportunities for success at school, work, and in the community. This work has inspired independent commitments to advance equity, including a $100 million 5-year funding initiative by Prosperity Together, a coalition of women foundations to improve economic prosperity for low-income women and girls of color, and an additional $75 million in research about women and girls of color, which is currently being led by Wake Forest University. There are now over 8 million minority-owned firms in the United States, a 38% increase since 2007. Last year, the SBA issued a new rule, making most individuals currently on probation eligible for an SBA microloan, a loan up to $50,000 that can help small business startups. In addition, the SBA partnered with the Kellogg Foundation and Justine Peterson to launch the Aspire Entrepreneurship Initiative, which is a $2.1 million pilot project to provide education and microloans to citizens returning to Detroit, St. Louis, Louisville, and even right here in Chicago. President Obama also sought to ensure that all courts are fair and reflective of the diverse communities which make up America by appointing more judges of color. During President Obama's term in office, the president appointed 62 African Americans to lifetime appointments to the federal court. 9 were appointed to the Federal Circuit Court and 53 to federal district courts. In addition, President Obama appointed 26 African American women to the federal court, which is more African American women than appointed by any president in our history. In total, 19% of President Obama's confirmed judges have been African American, compared to 16% under President Clinton and a paltry 7% under President George Bush. 5 states now have their first African American circuit judge. 10 states now have their first African American female federal judge, and 3 districts have their first African American district judge. Dr. Martin Luther King was a moving force in electing President Obama as president. Without Dr. Martin Luther King's intervention, influence, impact, and being our nation's moral compass, it would have taken much longer for this country to realize that each of us must be judged by the content of our character and not by the color of our skin. We owe Dr. Martin Luther King a debt of gratitude for his stewardship of American society, which has benefited each and every one of us. As the Republicans seek to roll back many of the changes brought about by President Obama, I think it's important to not only recognize the leap forward we've made as a result of President Obama being our nation's first African American president, but we must also remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. We must not let the shift in power in Washington cause us to despair. Rather, we must follow in the footsteps of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and to continue to do all in our power to carry on with the march towards justice and equality of all. We must now, all more than ever, follow the teachings of Martin Luther King. All Americans should cherish his legacy, his ideals, and his vision for now and forever. Thank you very much.